Thank you very much, Father Peter John. Please make sure that you interrupt me at around the 5 minutes to go mark, because I can go over time. I give you full permission. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Thokozile Madonko. I am a researcher in the Public Economy Project at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies based at Wits University. And a little bit of my bio, I have a very long history in budget work and budget advocacy work as well. And so this is very much a part of my day-to-day, doing, is that I think, breathe, talk about budgets. And I hope that by the end of today, you will also want to go away and read the budget speech and read the budget itself, the budget review and the budget documents, because they are extremely interesting. It's like reading a murder mystery. You get to find out who got taken out and who survives, and it's very exciting. So I'm going to talk a little bit just the nuts and bolts of the budget, and then touch a little bit on what I've been able to in the last short little period of the budget being tabled yesterday, and what I've been able to look at until today of the 2025 budget, and to try and provoke some questions, things to think about as we go forward in this first Government of National Unity budget. So I like to always say that the South African budget process, that the government's money is the people's money. That's why we should be interested in it. And that the budget is always a political exercise that starts with political choices about priorities and ends with political choices about which programs and projects get funded. So that's why we're here. We monitor the government's actions, commenting on its policies and plans, and challenging them to be rights-based, equitable, sustainable, and just. And sustainable has a double meaning there, both sustainable in the sense that they should be affordable, that we shouldn't be undertaking risky fiscal decisions, but also sustainable in the sense of our climate and our planet, and making sure that we are pursuing programs through the state and through the budget that promotes the greening of our economies, societies, and so forth. So why should we focus on economic policy? Why should we talk about the budget? And what is macroeconomic policy? So, these are jargons, and it's also important for us to be able to understand the terms that are being used. And macroeconomic policy is the use of monetary and fiscal policy to achieve economy-wide objectives. So monetary, fiscal policy is just another way of saying budget. And monetary policy is about money, as it says, is typically conducted by the Reserve Bank and comprises of decisions about interest rates, financial regulation, and inflation targeting. I'm not going to talk about that today because we often, we unpack the two, and we often leave the Reserve Bank in its own kind of world, and how the decisions that it makes, even though they have an impact on fiscal policy. I'm going to just focus on fiscal policy and not on monetary policy. We could have another session where we could talk about monetary policy and its impact on fiscal policy, but more broadly on the average South African. So fiscal policy or budget policy is determined by the government and covers public expenditure, taxation, and borrowing. So these are all familiar to you, because that's really what the last couple of weeks since the non-budget that was not tabled has thrown up an enormous amount of debate around what kinds of things we spend our public expenditure on, how we raise taxes, on whom we raise taxes, and how we borrow, and at what rate, and to what extent do we borrow, and in what way do we borrow. But the starting point is always policy and planning. So in order for us to fully understand what the budget means, we have to understand what the point is of the budget, and that sits with policy. And so I've just randomly picked a few. I could have chosen I've chosen here from a previous presentation, the strategy on early childhood development, but it could be health, it could be infrastructure, whatever it might be. But we really look at the Constitution, the National Development Plan, the medium-term strategic framework, the budget prioritization framework, but also what the GNU has put out as its priorities. And the State of the Nation address, when the president addresses the nation, was a good way of showing us what the priorities were for government. And so what we want to see is whether or not the budget is an expression in rands and cents of those policy priorities. So the medium-term development plan is a 5-year plan that is formed out of the National Development Plan. And the president said that there are 3 key priority areas. Just to note that this says the draft medium-term development plan. I haven't been able to access the final copy of the medium-term development plan. So if anybody has a copy, I'd love to get my hands on it. But I did have access to the draft. So the final one might be slightly different to the one that I'm presenting here. So the 3 apex areas were inclusive growth and job creation, reducing poverty and tackling the high cost of living, and a capable and ethical and developmental state. And so what we want to do is to see if the budget that was presented yesterday is actually contributing to these or exacerbating these. So is it really about inclusive growth and job creation? Will it reduce poverty and tackle the high cost of living? Will it be able to enable us to have a capable and ethical and developmental state? So the budget fits into understanding what our sectoral impact, our demographic and prevalence data, so that's our health data, unemployment rate, hunger, poverty, levels of inequality, gender inequality, gender-based violence. We then formulate on the basis of that rural-urban policy to address that information, to say that we want to make sure that we extend good quality healthcare to all. And so we have the National Health Insurance as a policy framework for that, for example, or we have the newly, the Bella Bill that extends grade R. So all of these set out the policy priorities. You then are meant to cost the programs to be able to understand, and this is with Treasury and the line ministries, to understand the cost of these programs, the costs of the policy, and then we do the resource allocation and budgeting, and then we have the structures and institutions for implementation, so education, health, who is best placed for doing early childhood development or doing the school feeding schemes. These are all decisions around how we actually structure the institutions for delivering public services. Then we have service delivery itself, so the implementation. And then we have the monitoring and evaluation, and we have a department that's also focusing on that, the DPME, Department of Planning and Monitoring and Evaluation. And then we assess those, and that's kind of the system in which we locate budgets within this policy framework. So I've set out a little bit about, the need for understanding the policy, and in order to understand the purpose of the budget. And now, the budget is governed by the Constitution, and we have 3 spheres of government that are distinctive but must act cooperatively and share the revenue raised nationally between province and national and local government. And there is then the Financial Fiscal Commission, which is often overlooked, which is a constitutional body that plays a role in informing the budget process and issues around financial and fiscal matters. Then we have the Public Finance Management Act that governs national and provincial, that looks at the financial management, the procedures relating to budgeting, the budgeting formats and financial management and reporting, and sort of sets out how the budget is brought together. At a municipal, a local government level, there's the Municipal Finance Management Act, which, sorry, is not there. We then have the Intergovernmental Fiscal Relation Act, which sets out the consultative bodies that need to be in place for bringing the budgets together. That establishes the Budget Council, the Minister of Finance, and the 9 MECs of Finance to facilitate consultation on financial and fiscal matters and legislation or policy with financial implications, and then also establishes the Budget Forum, which is the Budget Council, including organized local government, SOLGA. And this does all of the above with regard to local government, so looking at financial and fiscal matters. And so this is part of the budget process and was very much the kind of questions being asked about how did we get to a point where we couldn't table the budget? You know, what was the process? And this is governed by these various forms of legislation. Then when the budget hits Parliament, the big ticket item here is the Money Bills Amendment Procedure and Related Matters Act of 2009. And the objective is to provide for procedures to amend money bills before Parliament and for norms and standards for amending money bills before provincial legislatures and related matters. And it gives effect to what is in the Constitution, which says all money bills must be considered in accordance with the procedure established by Section 75. An Act of Parliament must provide for procedures to amend money bills before Parliament. And then lastly, it establishes the Parliamentary Budget Office, which has a role to play in providing recommendations and giving advice to the committees and to parliamentarians. And so we are now firmly in the Money Bills Amendment Procedure and Related Matters Act policy framework when we start looking at what happens since the budget has been tabled yesterday. So the budget, I'm going to go just show this in a big, to put it in the big picture, we're talking about the economy. It is the economy. It is about politics. And so everything is interlinked and can be seen as feeding into each other. So the government budget is around revenue and expenditure, but allocating of spending and the impact of spending, of government spending, can affect economic growth. And this is often overlooked in the conversations about the role and purpose of the budget. So many economists like to say that it's not, government's responsibility to affect employment, for example, or to spur economic growth. When in fact, other economists will argue that that's precisely when you're in a slump or you're in a low growth environment, this is when you need to see the allocation of spending to spur aggregate demand and to create multipliers in the system to allow for economic growth. And so there is some contestation around the ideas about what the purpose of the government's budget is in terms of economic growth. So you will hear a lot about the fiscal framework in the coming weeks. Because the Parliament now has the responsibility, its first job is to pass the fiscal framework. Well, what is the fiscal framework? So it's the national budget in non-legal economies. And it's the framework for a specific financial year, so this year, 2025. And it gives effect to the National Executive's macroeconomic policy, which was presented in October, and includes all estimates of all revenue, budgetary and extra budgetary, expected to be raised during that year. So that's the taxes and others. And then estimates of all expenditure, budgetary and extra budgetary specified separately for that financial year. So all the spending, and then estimates of borrowing. So what are they going to, how much borrowing will take place for that financial year, and the estimates of interest and debt servicing charges. And lastly, an indication of the contingency reserve necessary for an appropriate response to emergency or other temporary need. And that's essentially what the fiscal framework is. And it's critical for us to be able to understand that this is what the Parliament has the ability to amend. So it has a say on estimates of all revenue, estimates of all expenditure, estimates of borrowing, and the contingency reserve. So what are the critical issues in relation to Budget 2025 that I want to touch on very, very briefly in the time that I have? Is that we are coming out of a policy framework that is one of what Treasury calls fiscal consolidations, others will call it austerity. And what we have seen from the research that my colleague Michael Sachs has done is a declining size of the state amid rising uncertainty. And so what that means is that as a share of or global domestic product, GDP, core spending over the last while, particularly since 2012, but more so 2024 and onwards, there has been a driving down of core spending and revenue as a share of GDP, which really just means that we're saying that we're wanting to see a smaller state, a leaner state, a meaner state, a state that doesn't necessarily have a role to play in the economy. So we've argued that, has the austerity mission been accomplished? We asked the question, sorry, not argue, we asked the question. And we have seen that the government has reduced real spending per capita per person over the last 5 years. And since the COVID pandemic, core spending has fallen by 2,325 Rand per South African, from 30,440 in 2019 to 28,000 in 2023. What does that mean? It means that the state is spending less on public services for you as a South African, for each South African. And this has been the largest expenditure reduction in South Africa's democratic history. And the last period of austerity associated with GEAR led to a 6.3% reduction in real per capita expenditure, whereas the post-COVID austerity has already seen a reduction of 7.6%. So where is service delivery? Now, despite huge outcries and discussions that you hear in the media, the salary bill has actually been contained, and this is a strong piece of our research. So in some respects, the compensation spending has fallen in real terms for the last 4 years. And it's important for me to raise this because there's this idea out there that somehow our salary bill is too big and it's out of control. But this is not true. From our research, we can show you that the salary bill has fallen in real terms the last 4 years. So why did I bring up this past information? Is because I wanted to set the scene for when you listen to the other speakers who may give you more detail on the rands and cents of the 2025 budget, is that this fiscal framework is slightly unusual than what we've seen in the past, because we've actually seen an increase in spending than previously experienced. And so the fiscal framework has seen, and you see that in the jump between this year and last year and this year in expenditure, from 32.1% of GDP to 32.4% of GDP. So that's a jump in the real spending of the consolidated fiscal framework. So the budget has allocated above inflation and real increases to key spending areas that have been identified, such as health, in terms of health personnel, in education, which falls under learning and culture in the diagram in front of you. But we've seen also contributions to social development and peace and security in particular. The Department of Defense has received additional resources. So the budget, the budget is somewhat confusing, because they are still saying that they're going to try and stabilize debt, and we see that with the budget balance. But that it's not going to be as fast as they had hoped it would be. But there's still this big jump from next year onwards to make sure that we drive down the deficit from 4.6% of GDP to 3.8 in 2026 and 3.5 in 2027. So there's still this drive to narrow the deficit with increased expenditure, and with a very slight, not very slight, and a slight increase in revenue from 27.1% of GDP to 27.8% of GDP. So we are seeing an increase in spending than what we've seen in the past. But what many have argued is that this has just restored us to what it should have been about 4 or 5 years ago. So when we've seen these cuts, and there's quotes of the minister saying that the cuts have not worked, and so we needed to do something different, we are now seeing, and we welcome in some respects, the acknowledgement of the spending pressures on departments. Because if they had continued on the trajectory that they had laid out in last year's and in the previous year, 2023, medium-term budget policy statement, we would have seen huge, in fact, possible layoffs of medical personnel, teachers, and so forth. So we've seen an acknowledgement by the Government of National Unity that there needs to be prioritization for these spending choices. But we're also sitting in a strange situation where we have one of the largest partners in the Government of National Unity saying that they will not pass this budget unless certain things get met. So there is still a lot of question around the fiscal framework. So there are some fundamentals to remember about public finance. So budgets are relatively rigid. And what makes them rigid is the fact that we have compensation of employees, contracts, pensions, and debt repayments. And so these factors limit the amount of money that can be shifted in a single financial year. Budgets have winners and losers, and all budgets are based on balances and political trade-offs. What I get is what you don't get. So where should one look for this money? What trade-offs would need to be made to resolve your particular problem if you're a line ministry or whatever it might be? And what are the political costs that result from the change in the budget you want? So these are some of the questions that our parliamentarians are now going to ask of the fiscal framework in terms of the VAT increase, for example, or in terms of the fact that many of the allocations that have been set aside to health, education, social development, and so forth are provisional allocations and not actually ones that have necessarily been proposed to be appropriated this year. And so that results in some questions about the credibility of the budget that has been tabled and who then gets to have the say over whether monies that are supposedly allocated but not provisionally allocated are not spent. So I just want to give you a little note on fiscal consolidation and austerity. Is that
5 minutes?
Thank you. Is that fiscal consolidation or adjustment or constriction measures. And from my reading, I don't see that Treasury is moving fundamentally away from trying to lower the public the size of the budget. But we are in uncertain times, so I could be wrong. But it's important to know that the most common fiscal consolidation measures globally are ones that are either public expenditure cuts, which to date we have seen in South Africa, regressive tax changes, and we've again seen this in terms of the value-added tax changes and the decrease in corporate income tax, labor market reforms, which are ongoing, and then pension reforms, which we have recently seen in the two-part system, which we should be wary of, because while it's important for workers to be able to access their own money, we do need to make sure that people have enough money for their retirement. And the two-part system has unbalanced that a little bit, and so there needs to be some questions. But I do want to emphasize that not all fiscal constrictions are inherently harmful. So we do want to ensure, and we welcome the call to look at the spending reviews and to start asking some very hard questions about wasteful expenditure, because it can provide much needed revenue for social services. So I don't want you to think that I'm painting all fiscal consolidation with the same brush. Some fiscal consolidation is necessary, especially when you're talking about truly wasteful public spending. And I'm not talking about the bloated cabinet or, that's millions. We need to find billions in our system. And so we need to make some very difficult decisions about, both the policy as well as the budget in terms of what we want to see happen in the delivery of services in South Africa. The key problem of austerity is the limited role for government, and the policies of the state often prioritize the wealthy and big corporations and protect private property, and often drives the privatization of public goods, making people pay for essential services such as healthcare, education, water, public transport. And it tends to make the state unable or unwilling to adequately address systemic crises such as climate change and economic instability. So we still have to be very, very wary of any kind of argument that doesn't want to fully resource a government to be able to deliver much needed public services. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. The clarity and the insight together made it a wonderful presentation to listen to. So thank you so much. I hate it when people ask, but will the presentation be made available? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you once again. I'm not going to take any questions. I'm going to move straight to Philippe and ask him to go ahead with his presentation. We look very forward to listening to you.
Thank you so much. Let me just upload it. Now, yeah. Do you see it on your screen?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Philip.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So thank you for the opportunity to do this presentation. So I want to talk a bit about, the budget and the budgetary context of realizing socioeconomic rights in South Africa. Now, South Africa, the problem we face at the moment is we have a very constrained economy with very little growth. I think we grew at something like 0.6% last year. And that limits to a large extent the amount of money we can collect through taxes, because income is basically the source of one's taxes in the end. If your income as a country doesn't grow, then that erodes your tax basis. So we need to think about how we're going to expand our socioeconomic rights, the realization of those rights, but do so within a framework where our income is limited. And there you can see the real per capita real GDP per capita since 1994, and you can see it has gone up quite nicely up till about 2013, where after it started to decrease. So even though, let's say, you have an economic growth rate of 0.6% last year with a population that grows between 1 and 1.5%, that means that the economy per capita is shrinking. So we went from that to that. And it is that what you see there in the red, that is in essence the problem we have with a shrinking tax base through which we need to finance our expenditure. That then also translates, this is our debt GDP ratio in previous years. So again, you can see about 2009 is the break. And after that, it has gone up from 23, 24% of GDP all the way to 73%. And Treasury will foresee it going to 76% in the next couple of years. And that is the deficit, and the primary deficit. You'll hear them talk about the primary deficit is just the deficit without the interest expenditure. But you can clearly see after 2008, we've sort of permanently dipped into deficit territory, and we haven't surfaced from that. Now we have arrested the increase in expenditure through expenditure ceilings and things like that, but we haven't been able to really grow those services a lot, given the limited tax base and the growing debt ratio. So ideally, or rather, you'll see there that even the primary balance has improved. You can see that blue arrow there. It has strengthened, except now for the dip in COVID, but even after COVID. And you'll see the minister yesterday also predicted a primary surplus. But if you wanted your debt to stabilize, it needed to be around about where the green line is. And we are not there. We are at the moment there at the bottom. Okay, so we also sit in South Africa with the problem that our real GDP, that there's a negative relationship between our real GDP and government's consumption as percentage of GDP. The higher our consumption, government consumption as percentage of GDP has gone, that has been associated with lower GDP growth rates. So we see that as a problem. And that's just what we saw yesterday in the budget. This comes from the budget review. You see the red line there. That is what we expect the debt GDP ratio, or that's what Treasury expects. They want to stabilize it at about 76% and then slowly start to bring it down. Of course, I always joke that the debt GDP ratio is always forecasted to stabilize in year 3 of the medium-term framework, whichever year you look at. So we always move that on by another year or so. At the bottom, you'll see the problem. One of the problems we have, the red line there is the percent of revenue taken up by interest payments in South Africa, and the line, the black line at the bottom there. That's the median for countries. So you can see we spent a much larger chunk of the budget of our revenue on that, and that means that it's not available to spend on health or anything else. So now we've heard about the VAT increase. There you see where South Africa is compared to many other countries. There's about an average of 19%. We are at 15 and they want to move it slightly up to 16. Initially the non-budget was 17. They prefer VAT because, as you can see there, South Africa's the personal income tax as share of GDP is pretty high compared to other upper middle income countries. So when you look at all countries, we are sort of in the middle of the pack, but when you look at upper middle income and emerging market countries, we are on the high side. And the same goes for corporate income tax. What we've also seen the last time we increased these is that we increase the rate, but then through loopholes and through money going out of the country and all sorts of other adaptive behavior, the government doesn't really collect that much more taxes. So that is a problem. Hence, VAT, if you want to increase taxes, VAT is the more efficient one. But of course, it's also regressive and hit the poor more. Okay, so we've seen all these efforts, and Thokozile's colleague Michael Sachs has talked about South Africa faces a cul-de-sac of permanent austerity without consolidation. So we have cut expenditure, we've put in the ceilings, but yet the debt GDP ratio keeps on increasing, and it's very much also a problem of growth. Because it's the growth rate that is leaving us in trouble here. There are, of course, also those who think that we can spend more, and then by spending more, we'll grow the economy. And by doing that, if it's debt GDP, then more debt, and then that will lead to more GDP, and then the problem will solve itself. Unfortunately, the empirical evidence shows that it doesn't really work as nicely as that, even though we would have wished it to work like that, but it doesn't really work like that. But there is increased pressure. I mean, you all know about the court case the other day about the social relief of distress grant, where the court said it needs to be higher, it needs to be rolled out to more people. We'll see what happens when that goes to the Constitutional Court. Which brings me to the Constitution, of course. I mean, the Constitution, unlike, somebody mentioned what is happening in the US earlier in the discussion, but South Africa's Constitution has socioeconomic rights, which is not the case in the US. So we need to progressively realize these, which means as the resources become available, and that is now the problem. I think we sort of got, if we look at the constitutional framers in the early 90s, I think few of them actually expected that we will see a decade of negative per capita growth. So when we thought about progressive realization of rights, we were in a sense thinking that expecting a growth every year, add a bit to the economy, and then we could use a bit of taxes on that to realize the rights to a larger extent. But now we have had 10 years or longer of stagnation, and that means that the available resources per capita is shrinking. So how do you deal with that? And I'm not going to repeat everything there that you can find in the Constitution, but that's basically what is written there. So there's, of course, also what do we mean by this? And we have the famous Grootboom case of 25 years ago, where it talks about, when we talk about this constitutionally mandated rollout of progressive realization of rights, that it is very much contingent upon the availability of resources. But what do you do when resources shrink? Do you also roll them back? We call that, let me move on to that. We call that retrogression of realized rights? And that is very much the accusation that is made to government, saying, yes, but now you want to shrink the expenditure, and you are going to basically retrograde on these rights. You're going to default on this. You're going to roll them back. And can we do that? And there's also, to my mind, what I would call the rate of progressiveness in the rollout and intergenerational trade-offs. I'll touch on that a bit as we move. So we are here in a position where we need to say, okay, what do we do when we want to roll out progressively our rights, but that which we need to roll it out is in itself shrinking. And I think that is in essence the problem. South Africa's problem is in essence, yes, to some extent there's a problem with let's say inefficient expenditure and all of that. But in essence, the problem is one of a lack of economic growth. And how are we going to get to that? And what do you do in the meantime? Can you do retrogression of rights? There's a whole literature on that. Even the UN has written on that. And the point is, yes, you can do it, but under very limited conditions. And I think that is what we need to look at. I'm not going to read all of that, but you can see what it says. But it basically makes the point that if any deliberate retrogressive measures are taken, the state party has the burden of proving that they have been introduced after the most careful consideration. So, and I think that is, and they need to be justified. So what are we talking about? So first of all, I want to focus on those two aspects. Reasonable justification. When is it justified? When is it not justified? And what are the alternatives? There's a number of other things, but we do not have time to look at that right now. So I think we need to look at various cases. The first one is if the reduction in resources and revenue, if that is a temporary thing, like a cyclical downturn, economy going into a recession. In cases like that, I think there's no justification for the retrogression. Indeed, one thing that fiscal policy does is to provide a buffer for an economy that goes into a recession by increasing expenditure and creating a bit of a buffer to absorb the shock and keep on providing the sort of service delivery and everything that goes together with the rollout of these rights. The problem, though, comes, I think, and there it is, if we have a negative or a lower positive trajectory for a very long time, and it could be as a result of a shock, or it can be as a general slowdown in the economy, like we have seen. I mean, we have seen COVID, but we have also seen this more than a decade-long slowdown. In the case like that, there might be a justification, because we also need to read that together with another article in the Constitution, Article 2 or Section 215, which says that the national, provincial, and municipal budgets and budgetary process must provide transparency, accountability, and effective financial management of the economy, debt, and public sector. You can see it takes all of these things in one sentence, because they are very much interrelated into what we would call then fiscal policy and the budget. So if we want to do this, we need to say, okay, it needs to be justified, and we need to say, okay, what are the alternatives? The first thing is that the retrogression, the rate at which you reduce it, needs to be slower than the rate at which the economy shrinks. Okay? So that there is still some cushioning happening there. I think that is very important. And you also need plans on how you're going to restitute those rights the moment the economy starts to pick up again. So there needs to be a whole explanation clause linked to that explains what you're going to do. You need to be transparent. This is not a permanent cutback. This is something that you are going to have a look at. It's also important not just to look at the absolute amount of rands. Because, for instance, I'm going to give you an example. You can have an above inflation increase in salaries of, let's say, teachers and doctors. That does not mean that your service delivery improves. You're just paying them more. So let's say the number of doctors or teachers per 1,000 people might remain the same, but you're spending more. Now the same goes if it goes the other direction. If you give below inflation increases in salaries, but you don't reduce the number of teachers and doctors. So one should look at the number of indicators. I'm going to return to these indicators. You need to look at a number of these indicators. And not just the money, but also things like doctors per 1,000 people, your teacher-student ratios, schools, etc. Okay, so and then you need a plan on how you're going to reverse this, as I said, as the moment economic growth starts to come back. Okay, that brings me to the economic growth. And also the fact that I think when we talk about sustainable development, when we talk about the rollout of socioeconomic rights, we need to take an intergenerational or intertemporal view of this. And we need to keep in mind what our future generations. And here I often refer to the Brundtland Commission's definition of sustainable development, where it says sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So it doesn't help, in short, to spend on these services, and then 5 years or 10 years or 15 years down the line, we are forced to roll them back anyway, because then we are disadvantaging the future generations. So we need to strike a balance between these two. And I also need to think that, so there is a variation of this definition where I say, if I have a rand to spend, do I spend it on a higher social wage for the present generation, or do I invest it to improve the lives of future generations? That is also something that is important. And how we need to keep it in mind, and think about the debt. We don't want Herbert Hoover's sarcastic warning that blessed are the young, for they shall inherit the national debt. We need to guard against that, because that is in essence where we are moving to at the moment if we look at the debt ratios. So let me move towards the end. So what I think, when you do it in this intergenerational framework, we need to look at the socioeconomic rights and service delivery linked to that now in terms of education, healthcare, grants, all of that, but also look at the investments needed that government needs to do in public infrastructure, etc., to foster economic growth that will in future generate the taxes that will allow us to bring services to the bigger population in terms of education and health and so on in the future. There's always this trade-off. And by investment, I mean both physical and human capital investment in education. I don't necessarily, I don't see the payment of a salary of a teacher as just a current expenditure. It's an investment in future generations. Well, just to show you, South Africa has seen a shrinkage in terms of what its government spends on capital in investment in infrastructure. It's very low, and it's one of the reasons that why we are growing so slowly. That is one of the reasons. So what I'm sort of calling for, and you'll also hear there's a document that accompanied the budget review on fiscal anchors. What I'm calling for is something, a framework where I say, okay, we need 4 components. And we need indicators for all 4 of these components, and we need to take a balanced view of all of them. The first one is the progressiveness of our, and the extent to which we realize our socioeconomic rights, where we have indicators to look at that. Education, health, all of those indicators. But then we need indicators, yes, the fiscal anchors, that would be, what is happening to debt, what is happening to deficits, that would be those indicators, and we need to keep them in mind. It would also include things like efficiency indicators, like the ministry indicated they will be looking at together with the presidency. But then we also look at the level of and sustainability of economic growth. What sort of investment ratios do you need to get growth? And there's a lot of empirical work on that. I've done some of that work myself. where we say, okay, we need to strike a balance between the service delivery of the current generation, but what investment do we need to cater for the future, for future generations? And then linked to that, of course, we need to ensure that that economic growth is also inclusive. In other words, all the gaps that we have, income gaps, poverty levels, etc., all of that needs to shrink. And we need to ensure that growth rate translates into that, so that it's not just enriching a small proportion. And together we need that set of, it might be a set of 15 or indicators. And I think when we look at the budget, because what we now see is we're now going to undergo something that South Africa has not been used to. Our parliament has never really changed the budget, but now with a government of national unity where no party has an absolute majority, and where you'll need to have some horse trading between the parties in terms of changing the budget, maybe more tax here, less expenditure there, etc., etc. We need to have debates about what that should look like, and that debate we probably need to have transparency in that, for that, and that debate can be conducted with a series of indicators that look at these four dimensions, and together we can then get a clear picture of what is sustainable. But I'm talking about, so it's not a choice of being either fiscally sustainable or developmentally sustainable. It's a both and story. We need to be both fiscally and developmentally sustainable, because if we're not that, we are neither. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Another wonderful presentation, and really full of insight, but also full of good technical knowledge. So thank you to both of you. Kenny, can you help me as to whether our third speaker has arrived, or?
Yes, indeed, Father. Zambali is here. Yeah, I saw him earlier. Let me just check if he's still online.
Yes, I am.
Great. Thank you, Zambali. Oh, there you are. Thank you. We're going to throw you in at the deep end, if you don't mind. And if you would make your comments now, and then we will take a broader discussion around all three contributions. You're very welcome, and we're delighted you're with us. So may I hand over to you immediately.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I sincerely apologize for joining in late. I had an appointment which I had to step out of now, but just please let me know if you can see my screen.
We can, thank you.
Awesome. So we're going to be speaking, or I'm going to be speaking based on the IJ's statement, which we have released, that takes into account the different areas of the budget, but I won't cover all areas. So we believe that the budget that was delivered, which is now known as Budget 2.0, fails to meet the social and economic challenges that we are confronted with, which include poverty, inequality, and job creation, right? Failing to create jobs, rather. And we believe that this is premised from this fiscal strategy that has been adopted, which only focuses on primarily debt stabilization and the quest for a budget surplus. And we see that there's a commitment in the budget to keep the surplus over the next 10 years. We've noted that there are reversal in terms of spending cuts, but these are still below the historic cuts that we've seen since 2012, and therefore calls for a interrogation of the extent to which we need to spend in order to recover our public services and our key social and economic areas. We note that there is a trend to revenue in order to finance our priorities, but we've seen that some of the revenue proposals in this budget still disproportionately impact low-income households and the poor. And then there's also an increasing reliance on infrastructure development through the centering of private finance in financial mechanisms such as public-private partnerships and de-risking and blended finance, which we'll touch on these later on. But ultimately, we believe that where we are at the moment in terms of some of the parties in Parliament and within the GNU itself saying that they don't support the budget, it's an important moment for our democracy and for the legislature to propose amendments that will ensure that the budget supports the poor and is also pro-growth. So before the budget, we proposed that there are three pathways that we could go. That is between the 19th and yesterday. And that was either cutting expenditure, something which we've seen over the years and which hasn't delivered in terms of reducing the debt to GDP ratio, but also in terms of sparing growth. Or we could raise borrowing, or we could raise additional revenue. So these are the three pathways that we said the budget could go. And we've noted that it is the one that is on the right, which is raising additional revenue, which has been taken up with some revisions in terms of allocations to key priority areas. And I'll go into detail on that now. But before going into details in terms of the expenditure, it's to start by emphasizing the point that the current fiscal strategy prioritizes the debt stabilization above all else. And we see this through our organizations and our coalition, the Budget Justice Coalition, has highlighted that budget cuts, which have been the main mechanism which the government has sort of relied on to stabilize debt, haven't delivered, and they haven't resulted in a stabilization of the debt to GDP ratio. Yesterday, the Minister of Finance came out to admit that this strategy hasn't worked, and therefore they are shifting to raising revenue. And I quote, he said that we've not achieved fiscal consolidation. Instead, the budget cuts have not had an increase in debt to GDP ratios. He said this yesterday. And so when we are thinking about whether spending has resulted in increased growth or not, and the evidence around that, we also need to interrogate whether or not budget cuts have resulted in increased growth. And what we are seeing now in the charts that I think Philip showed us before my presentations need to be assessed on the back of this fiscal strategy, which, although we welcome the shift to a slight shift in terms of revenue and considering other alternatives, we still see that there is no impact assessment of how it has harmed growth. There's no impact assessment of how it has harmed servicing and key service delivery areas. And there is also the proposal of a fiscal anchor. We've released a discussion document which shows that a fiscal anchor or fiscal rules should not be overestimated in terms of their efficacy in helping us address our debt concerns and stabilizing debt. And so we are very concerned that this is being considered, even though there is this purported shift towards away from austerity, because some of the impacts of fiscal rules from our discussion paper, we found that they result in entrenching austerity when government are trying to adhere to some of these limits that are placed on them. They result in untransparent ways of creating and managing the budget process, and they also increase conflict and contestation that is not necessarily held in a democratic manner, which is what we aspire to see in South Africa. So rather than the proposal of a fiscal rule, we believe that there should be an opening up of the debate around fiscal policy and the budget in particular. And I think the current moment we're in presents that opportunity to Parliament, and would be keen to participate on that. Having said that, I think we agree that there is a need to address the debt issue, particularly in reducing the cost of debt, and that this is a better way of trying to achieve fiscal sustainability rather than simply imposing or considering imposing a fiscal rule. And some of the measures, we detailed them elsewhere in our policy brief, but they include the use of capital management techniques, such as capital controls, and this can help us stabilize short-term and speculative flows and allow the intervention in terms of reducing interest rates. We've also proposed that the South African Reserve Bank can purchase government bonds, and we can also use prescribed assets to make large pools of capital available at affordable rates other than what is provided for in the market. So in terms of the budget itself, like I said earlier on, we are seeing that non-interest government spending, which is government spending minus debt liabilities, increases on average about 0.85% over the medium term. This is a slight decline according to our analysis compared to what was proposed in February, where it was proposed to grow on about 0.88%. And this has implications for our healthcare and education spending. It means that they also, for the first time in a while, there are no cuts to healthcare and education. Healthcare in particular is proposed to increase by 1% over the medium term, whilst education will see an increase of about 1.42% due to increased expenditure to the ECD sector and also some additional allocations to support headcount shortfalls. And this also sees an increase in terms of what the government is spending per person in healthcare. However, it's still below pre-pandemic levels. We see that in terms of the amount that the government is spending per person, we're still about 469 below. Even in education, whilst there is an increase in per learner spending, it's still about 419 rands below it's still about 657 rands below what we saw in 2019. And so this is just to highlight the extent to which we still are not yet nowhere near where we should be in terms of reversing the budget cuts or going back to where we should have been spending. And then when you look at the social grants, there is I'll start with the social relief of distress grant. it's still limited at 370 rands per month. And this is far below the food poverty line of 796. We are still seeing that it's not provided for from 2026, although there are provisional allocations. However, we still, it raises questions on whether these are seen as actual expenditure that is allocated to the grant, or is something that is just put there in case of emergency. And it's something that will raise in the parliamentary processes around why it's actually not fully funded over the MTF. The child support grant is 560 or increased to 560, but this is still below as well the food poverty line. And our colleagues from the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity groups show that you need about 961 rands in order to provide a child a nutritional diet. So looking at these increases, even though some of the other, all the grants except the SRD receive above inflation increases, when you couple this with the VAT increase and the fact that these grants are still way below the food poverty line, it won't be necessarily shield the poor from the high cost of living and the potential increase in food prices due to VAT. And this is just to show where would it been if government spending had continued to increase in line inflation. You can see that the line that takes into account inflation is orange. It's much higher than the blue line, where we simply nominally increasing inflation. Non-interest spending.
5 minutes.
And then there's, sorry,
5 minutes left, Simbali.
Okay, I'll try to rush over these next
Thank
few
you.
ones. And then we see that there are tax proposals. Obviously, the one that has taken some headlines is the VAT increase, despite some backtracking over the 2% on the 2 percentage point proposal. The budget still proposes 0.5% percentage point increases over the next 2 years. And we saying that this is going to be a blow to the poor. It's going to reduce disposable income available to poor households. And although there has been the extension of the zero rating, we don't believe that this will provide sufficient cover for poor households. We also think that despite the government acknowledging that the CIT, or rather stating that the CIT and PIT are not viable in terms of increasing them, which we are opposed to. They haven't assessed that the VAT actually led to 22 billion lower revenue than what was expected when the VAT was increased from 14 to 15%. And so it speaks to how the budget process hasn't really taken into account evidence in terms of some of the proposals that it's put forward. There's also personal income tax bracket freezes, and we believe that the move to freeze all brackets is in an untargeted way means that lower income households will be affected and will face higher taxation. And so overall, on the side of tax, although there's a 10 to tax, there is no progressive revenue measures that are considered, including the commitment to a wealth tax, including removing tax breaks on medical aid and retirement funds, or even considering restoring the corporate income tax back to 28% and proposing a luxury VAT as opposed to a poor VAT increase, or a VAT increase that will hurt the poor. And then lastly, and then I'll conclude, there is this over-reliance on the private sector. So whilst there is a welcomed focus on infrastructure development, given its impact on economic growth, we're seeing that there is a centering of public-private partnerships and IPPs in ESCOM in particular, in terms of addressing the challenges there. And these internationally have been shown, the evidence on and PPPs is that they actually put financial risks on the state. They are environmentally harmful, and they will limit access to basic services in the long run when users are passed on the user fees in order to generate profits for the private sector. So overall, they are risky to the fiscus, but also they generate profits for the private sector as opposed to enabling equal access to public goods. And I think the slides that Prof. Philip showed around our constitutional obligations, we need to read the move towards PPPs against those constitutional obligations and whether or not they help us enable them. And our view is that they are actually a regressive move. And so going into Parliament, we hope that the parties and the MPs in Parliament and the financial standing committees, appropriation committees, will consider these proposals, which is the removals of a VAT increase, restoring the corporate income tax back to 28%, and the retirement and the removal of the retirement fund tax credits accruing to those that earn above 1 million. And lastly, an increase in the allocation to the social relief of distress grant. And yeah, I'll pause there due to time, but we are very keen to participate in the parliamentary processes and see through that a pro-poor and a pro-growth budget is passed on. Thank you.
Thank you, Zimbali. Thank you so much. We've really had three very wonderful contributions this afternoon, and there have been points of convergence, and there have been points that have gone into separate trajectories, but we also know that there's a huge amount of wisdom in the number of people who've gathered with us this afternoon, and it's a big number. So I'm going to switch over immediately to the contributions and the questions and answers, and but the contributions particularly, we're a group with a huge amount of wisdom and insight, and so we'd love to garner that and to see, as Zimbali said to us now, how we can take this forward. I'm going to ask, because I want to be the guy who looks nice in all of this, I want to ask Kenny to pick up the participants, and so nobody blames me for ignoring their hand or blocking them. Kenny will be the bad cop in all of this. So Kenny, if you can just come in and accept and open up for questions, please.
Thank you, PJ, for throwing me into that little problem there. Yeah, no, I'll be the bad cop, and as such, can I abuse that and ask the first question, maybe to the panelists? I was just wondering, any of the panelists can hopefully you can help me out here. So in terms of the budget process, so the minister made the announcement that VAT will be increased by 0.5 percentage point. In order for that to be changed, like what Zimbali proposing that should be done, how will that unfold? Can it be done through the money bills, where Parliament looks at it and discuss and debate and amend? Can it be done through that, or must it be a separate piece of legislation that Parliament needs to introduce specifically to negate that VAT increase? Thank you. Anyone?
So I'll
Maybe,
try and
no,
go ahead.
no,
No,
Thokozile,
please
go.
go ahead. No, 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 no.
No, you're more than welcome.
Sorry, I was just quickly finding my papers. So what happens is it's to answer your question partly, Kenny, it's a bit unclear. And this came up in the 2018 VAT increase, because what happens is you have the fiscal framework that is tabled, which includes revenue estimates, which includes assumptions about tax. But tax is the tax bill is tabled separately to the money bills. So the tax amendment bills are separate to the money bills. So it's a little bit unclear how they interact with each other and their timing. And so maybe Prof will know a bit more about this than I do. But there's a little bit of a gray area around, it's often why tax, traditionally we haven't heard about tax changes until the day of the budget because they're so sensitive. And so, we don't often hear about them in October in the medium-term budget policy statement, because there is the sensitivity about tax changes. And then they get tabled in terms of the tax laws, the TLABs or whatever they're called. But then you have this question about amending the revenue, the fiscal framework. So one of the things that we've been talking about is that the lawyers are going to have to get quickly involved in how this whole process is going to unfold for Parliament, because these pieces of legislation, the piece of legislation, which is the Money Bills Amendment and Related Matters Act, has not been tested. We've never used it. And so this is the first time that we're actually going to be potentially, maybe the DA will get what it wants and then we'll pass this budget. But potentially, if there is no agreement reached in 16 days, because they have 16 days within which to reach an agreement before the House. So it makes it, legally a very, very interesting space to be in, because the timing is different for the tax legislation than it is for the money bill legislation. The timeframes are much tighter for money bills. It has to be done in 16 days. So the 2nd of April, so it kind of rolls on so that the provinces can get moving and local government can get moving. So there's a knock-on effect. But the tax can chug along for quite a while. And that's why we had the whole, special commission into the increase of the VAT and zero-rated goods in 2018. There was time spent. But it was never 100% clear, because at that time, there was no question of not passing or amending the bill, the fiscal framework. The question was then pushed to, okay, let's hear a little bit more about what the impact of value-added tax is on the system. So again, it wasn't really tested in relation to the amendment powers of Parliament. Maybe the Prof has a bit more to say.
No, I think you've captured it. Maybe just to add something else, and I think the more difficult part is not so much sorting out the legal intricacies of what needs to happen in terms of law, but will be the horse trading in between the parties. That's going to be the real difficult part, because I don't think any of the GNU partners, other than the ANC, or any of the opposition parties, want to be seen as a party supporting a VAT increase. So I very much doubt that they will gather the votes. I think they will try to negotiate. The minister mentioned that they will see the second increase of 0.5 percentage point next year. They'll see whether that is necessary. And I think they'll try to make a bargain on that one and say, let's stick to 0.5%. But I don't think any party, for political reasons, want to be seen as the party who supported this. So I think it's going to be very messy. But that is part of what democracy is. It is a messy thing. So we need to learn how to deal with that. The many other countries are doing precisely the same thing. I mean, just look at even in the US when they have these there's even worse, when everything comes to a standstill and they don't pay civil servants because of these, and then at 10 to 12 at night they get some agreement, and it's messy, and I think we'll need to learn to live with that. But I also think that it will also hold a lesson for the future, because I think it will teach us to do a lot of this negotiation before budget day, and not think that we can just make the big announcement on budget day.
Thank you, Dr. Zile and Prof. Yeah, it's going to be messy, and I'm not quite sure how we're going to move forward on it. It'll be interesting to see how we're going to actually resolve it, or how the parties will do so. And just another question, I don't see any hands as yet, so I'm going to abuse my privilege. Just another question again. So, I mean, obviously, this particular so-called crisis is also an opportunity for the GNU partners to flex their muscle, so to speak. So would, for example, the Democratic Alliance, which is the biggest party, and if they, opposition party, technically, if they don't vote for the budget, I'm not quite sure where the ANC will get the necessary votes from. But what kind of bargaining chips, for example, would the DA have? Would they, for example, come out and say, you know what, actually start by saying, you know what, we said we didn't like some of the acts previously, the Expropriation Act, the Bella Act, and so forth. Would they use that as a bargaining chip and say, if you don't give us what we want in this particular term, we're not going to support your budget? And it's an open question. I mean, I'm not quite sure. I mean, can they do that? Will they do that?
I think they have done that, Kenny. That's part of the reason why they are not supporting the budget. So, and it's been raised by the minister as well, that they've been using these acts. I mean, the DA is very much wounded since the past 3 months. It's been announcements of, the Bella Act, where the minister was caught in between. They were found wanting, the Expropriation Act, and these have come up, but the ANC has not budgeted. And so that's why we are here, and they haven't reached an agreement. Because ideally what should have happened is that the initial budget that was presented was supposed to go to Parliament, or at least that's how we saw it, and debated in Parliament. But then it was taken back to GNU so that they can find each other. And then they haven't found each other. And so we're back to where we were in February, whereby now the DA has to work within, the sort of like party lines, as opposed to within the GNU, in terms of maneuvering around this budget. For me, it raises the bigger question as to how sustainable this coalition is going forward. And of course, the increasing role that Parliament would have to play. But I'm not sure if it's going to last until the next election. I'd be keen to hear what others think.
Thank you, Zambali. Peter John, I saw your hand on. Soko, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add to that. So I think some of the debates around the kind of political learning of our young democracy around coalition governance is that whether or not we want to see the budget being used as a weapon, or the budget being weaponized in political wrangling. Is this the space in which these kinds of fights should be playing out? Because it's so risky in terms of the markets, in terms of people's livelihoods, in terms of, the stakes are incredibly high when it comes to messing around with a budget for South Africa, given that we're an open, small, emerging open market. The interesting thing is that there are examples from other countries where, like the Germans and I think the Finns, where they agree to a fiscal framework, essentially, as part of the coalition agreement. And so they have the budget policy is set in the coalition arrangements and agreements. And then they go ahead, create a cabinet, an executive, and then go ahead and form their budgets. So one of the questions that we've been having in our center and talking about is, if you don't have an executive, do you have a government?
If I can add, I mean, and even in the German case, I mean, this past election took place because of a difference in about whether the debt brake should be applied or not, or relaxed or not. So even in that case, but I agree with you that we need. I think and that goes back to the post-election part that we saw, where the Constitution requires us to form a government within quite a short period of time, and it didn't allow a lot of space to negotiate the things we agree on in a coalition. And usually there would be some framework where the various parties agree on what the common agenda would be for the coalition. That didn't really happen, and now one of the outstanding issues would be this one. My suspicion is that they will push to come back to your question, Kenny. They will probably. They won't be really able to open up all the big debates that Bella and all of that all over again. I suspect in the end it will have to be some compromise about a review of expenditure and expenditure cuts versus tax, limited to the content of the budget. And then the thing to look at is, who are the easy things to cut, because then the danger comes in that important infrastructure things might be cut, because you don't want to cut salaries of let's say civil servants. Things like that might come up. So it will be important to really keep an eye on what the aspects are that they negotiate about.
Thank you for your feedback. Peter, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, no, I was just going to speak about the weaponization as well, that this has become an area for other pet bits of legislation to be fought around, and how unfortunate that was, I think. But so I'm covered, thank you.
I don't see any hands or any questions. Just to remind colleagues that there's a feedback form in the chat box. So we'd be very appreciative if you could just take some time just to fill it out. It just kind of it gives us a minute. At least it takes less than a minute to fill in, and it gives us some feedback in what areas that for future can we concentrate on, and just where we can improve, that type of thing. So please take some time just to do that. I see there is a hand up, Wahid. Let me just give Wahid a chance to speak quickly.
Thank you, Kenny, and thank you to the CPLO. So, Kenny, maybe a close-out question. Not that I want to take over your session, but if each speaker could give, say, their top 3 ideal, what would they have liked to see? So, if Thokozile, Professor, Philippe, and your other speaker, what would they like to see, knowing that we a shrinking economy with a growing population in a very, very hostile global economy with our history. We haven't spoken touch about redistribution. How do you grow the economy? Do the wealthy give up more and we grow the bottom up? Or do we go the DA approach, etc., etc.? So anyway, yeah, let the intelligent people give us yeah, put them on the spot. Thank you, and thanks for the session.
Thank you, Wahid. Yeah, maybe we should. That would be the last question. Maybe we can close on that. Three top things that you would have wanted to see. Let's start with Tokozile, then Philippe, and then Zimbabwe. And I think that will be the last then. Just to sum up.
To sum up, I'll try and be very quick. So I'm accused of being a kind of an idealist, I suppose. But what I would like to have seen is firstly a change in our fiscal policy. So remember, I said we always start with policy. And so we've been pursuing a neoliberal policy, which really means small roles for the state, cut back the state. The private sector will do all the delivery and, basically, and you make sure that you don't tax people. So the first thing is I would want to throw that out and say we need a stimulus project. We need a rights-based, pro-poor, pro-equality growth strategy, because we can have growth. We've had growth in South Africa, but it hasn't necessarily translated into greater equality and better conditions for everyone. So I would like to see a stimulus package where we see the role of the state as one as having an active state and with active fiscal policy that can generate the needed employment, in particular, focusing on employment to enable economic activity to take place and thereby, spur on growth and spur the private sector to engage. In terms of redistribution, I would have liked to have seen an introduction of a wealth tax on the ultra-rich. And this is something that is coming under the UN Tax Committee. So the United Nations is discussing this around that, as well as a cost of capital kind of process in which we actually look at why our debt is so expensive, how much of our debt is actually legitimate debt. Some of it was incurred under state capture, some of it flows over from apartheid days. So we need to make sure that we also do an audit of our debt that we're paying, that is crowding out for health services and education and so forth. And then lastly, to change the language around, and Prof did touch on this, that investing in teachers, nurses, doctors, municipal cleaners is an investment. It's not a cost. And so we should see that as part of our infrastructure and not talk about the wage bill as some kind of, ball and chain on which we need to deal with. These are workers in one system. When we talk about the employment statistics, we're not saying employment in the private sector only or employment in the public sector only. When we look at employment overall, we put them all together. So firing 30,000 public sector employees, for example, would up our unemployment rate. So it doesn't make sense. So those are the kinds of things that I would have liked to have seen tabled instead of the budget that was tabled. And no touching that. Leave it alone.
Thank you. Thank you, Toko. Prof?
So I would not so much go for a stimulus because I don't think we can afford it. But I do think we need to look at the reorganization of our expenditure and our revenue towards more growth enhancing measures. So I think that is very important. We need to get the infrastructure going. We need to fix our education system. We need to get our bottlenecks in the economy, harbors and roads and all of that sort of stuff sorted out, and that will support our growth. we need, so that's the one thing. The second thing is I do think that doing that, but within the constraint of stabilizing our debt GDP ratio, I don't think we really have much of a choice doing that. And that makes it very difficult because it will entail difficult choices, but we need to explain to people what it is that how these trade-offs work, so that everybody has full information to take informed decisions. And then I do think that in terms of how we budget to do that full information decision making, we need to move towards a framework where our budget is properly informed, and our budget documentation, so on, is informed by what we're looking for in the Constitution. And that set of indicators that straddle those four things that I talked about earlier, so that we answer in an account in terms of those things. And then we can have a serious debate on these things. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. I think we've lost Mbali, so maybe we can close Peter John.
I see
Thank
him.
you.
Oh,
Yeah.
are you still here? Sorry, I don't
Ah.
see you. Oh,
No.
okay. Sorry,
I wonder
Zimbabwe.
why you can't see me. But anyway, in any case, I think I'm covered by Togo. I fully agree with her. What I would say is that we still need to see the budget as one of the ways that can help transform our society and our economy. And like Togo said, this means using the budget to stimulate demand in the economy and expand supply. And I agree that our debt trajectory is a concern, particularly the cost of debt. And like I said in my presentation, while this is an important concern, I wouldn't have proposed a fiscal, or I wouldn't have put down the idea of a fiscal rule, but rather proposed a toolkit that can help us address the cost of debt, including using prescribed assets and particularly emphasizing the role of the Reserve Bank, but also growth in itself, pursuing it in more efficient ways that can help us bring down the debt to GDP ratio as opposed to cutting expenditure. And then lastly, mobilizing revenue. I agree with the idea of a wealth tax. And I think that another important proposal we raised was the GFECTRA, which the government has previously used to pay down debt. They drew down about 150 billion. It now still has about 346 billion. And so it could still be used and channeled towards key social and economic priorities. And then lastly, a basic income grant. Like Togo said, I think it's often also used against jobs to say that we're creating a welfare state, ignoring the important benefits that the grant gives people in terms of searching for jobs, sustaining their livelihoods, and also stimulating local economies. So those are the key proposals I would have raised, and that I think are still possible to be raised within the parliamentary processes.
Thank you, Zimbabwe. Apologies for not seeing you. PJ, if you can just
Thank
close.
you.
Thank you.
I think a real sign of how important this discussion was that it's run over time with hardly anybody leaving us. So that's a very that's a compliment to everyone and a measure of the concern that we all have, and hopefully also of our commitment to advocacy around these important issues. So to our three speakers particularly, I am most grateful, and our office is most grateful for your insights. I'm sure that Kenny will be asking for those presentations, and we thank Kenny and Sue as well for putting this together and for providing such a great insight into what seems so often a mysterious and complex kind of exercise. So to everybody, much gratitude, and please do fill in the feedback form, and if you're not on our mailing list for future events, please ensure that you do so. So to everybody, thank you very much and good afternoon.
Thank you.